Hi everyone, I'm Johannes Keating. This is for those of you curious to learn a bit about me, my training background, and my outlook when it comes to ISTDP-informed work. I'm going to convey a bit of a bulleted picture that should give you a taste for what I'm about and how I think. So I engaged in weekly supervision with Marvin Scorman from 2012 to the end of 2021. That stint of training was so immersive. I transcribed almost every single supervision and training session. I think my total number of hours with him reaches around 800. I've lost count, frankly. I've also had some peripheral training from other teachers. Dr. Stephen Buller, I only had a handful of sessions with him, but what a gem, really. And then very peripherally also, I've learned from people like Dr. Jim Schubmel, John Fredrickson, and Dr. Patricia Coughlin. All those people have influenced me in one way or another, and I'm grateful to them. But the bulk of my training was definitely with Marvin Scorman. He sanctioned me to teach and supervise in 2017. And that reminds me, I actually learn a heck of a lot from everyone that I supervise, to the point where I sometimes wonder who should be paying who. So that's basically my claim to fame. I don't have any formal certifications, just a truckload of hours of, consisting of grinding away at this and burning the midnight oil, reviewing sessions, reviewing supervisions, transcribing those supervisions, and then also keeping one eye on some of the literature has also been part of my learning picture. And the 9 years neck deep in the trenches of community mental health, that also really prepared me to work with some of the more challenging presentations and psychic organizations that are out there. As for the clinical flavor of my style, the human connection takes priority. The technique operates in the background, if you will, and is held spaciously. I try to remain open-hearted, and if there was ever a choice between engaging a technique or remaining open-hearted, I'd choose the latter all day long. On my best days, there is no such choice to be made, fortunately, as the two somehow become some sort of seamless whole. I believe that the conscious therapeutic alliance is supremely important and something that often needs to be continuously nurtured and underscored. I tend to keep a very close eye on undoing compliance and defiance, not stepping into the shoes of genetic figures. I work hard at keeping the transference clean, as they say. And based on having skinned my niece a lot and making a lot of mistakes in the early phase of my training and career, I tend to not want to throw well-rehearsed techniques and straight lines at my clients, the script, but instead come to shared understandings of what's occurring and what's getting in the client's way collaboratively. So I'll take being less polished but more present any day, though I'm sure better therapists than myself can accomplish both. On a good day, I don't jump into directive interventions on a hair trigger, but I hold off a little bit until I'm really crystal clear on what I'm dealing with. And again, I try to enlist the client in helping me reach that clarity and understanding. Allowing myself to be unsure, to remain in a state of not knowing until clarity emerges over time, preferably again with the client's collaboration, that's important to me. It prevents what I can feel to be a somewhat reactive or automated way of working based on insufficient information. I think this is also how I capitalize on whatever assistance my own unconscious brings to bear in the process, while also not undermining the time and space needed for the patient's spontaneity and the unconscious therapeutic alliance to have room to come out. I can see how if I'm overly structured and circumscribed in the way that I work, I can actually cut off avenues where the patient's unconscious therapeutic alliance might rear its head. So open-ended questions and remaining silent, that can really enrich my work. And some days, it just may take me a little longer to see what's going on than it might for someone else. Or I might need to feel more of a connection to the client before feeling comfortable engaging in more forceful work or intense work. I've gotten burned more than once when I assumed that there were no barriers to engagement, but there really were, just well hidden. It's important for me to stay true to myself and where I'm at. That takes priority over fidelity to a method, and I encourage my trainees to adopt a similar attitude. Sometimes I realize that I'm overfunctioning, even when from an outside point of view I'm adhering quite well to the central dynamic sequence, but I can tell that something feels out of alignment sometimes, and that overactivity on my part results in papering over the real emotional closeness between the client and myself, and obscures whatever it is that I can sense but perhaps not yet put a finger on. So think of the irony. I'm seemingly adhering, right, to the central dynamic sequence just fine, and yet the activity on my part can cover up the real stimulus that the client is having real feelings about, which is often a budding sense of closeness between the client and myself, or some way that I've stepped in the shoes of a genetic figure and I'm recreating some negative dynamic with the patient. But whatever it is, it can very easily actually get papered over by overactivity on my part. Even when on the outside, it very much looks like I'm just following the central dynamic sequence. So perspectives like that have been important to me. So I have fine-tuned my eye and broadened the scope of what I attend to when it comes to intervention response. I've made peace with the fact that I can't always work at top speed, for better or worse, though I do think that sometimes slower in the end ends up being faster. As you would hope, I attend closely to several of the important parameters of assessment, or I try to attend to all of them, including the level of rise and thresholds, the front or the major column of defense. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm on the lookout for barriers to engagement, but sometimes I'm wary of the diagnostic categories that are commonly discussed. Since my training did not stress those categories, however, my thoughts on this could be just wrong. It wouldn't be the first time I'm wrong about something, but that shouldn't be a reason to hold back on my thought process. So I'll say a few words on this, since I'm sometimes asked why I don't tend to use the same nomenclature as a lot of people in the community do. I think the diagnostic categories can very much be useful guides, but I do think that people are often too fluid and complex to neatly fit into them. Thresholds often vary, for example, depending on the area that's being explored. So after a couple of hours of capacity building, a patient may have a newfound ability to contain anxiety in the striated muscles while beginning to face rage and guilt towards a sibling, for example, while still going to repression or projections when focusing on, say, sexualized rage towards the mother. I've also thought about how, in order to get real meaningful precision around these categories through inner rater reliability, you'd have to somehow quantify doses of pressure. So you can see how complex it gets, especially since you're basically dealing with a moving target as the treatment is progressing. I mean, you'd need a different diagnostic category for so many angles that you'll end up with a sort of jigsaw patchwork situation rather than anything resembling something uniform or monolithic. So for me personally, the labels themselves aren't that important, though I understand their importance, especially for research purposes, obviously. So, and also if allowed to, they can really overshadow the client's strengths and what's unique about the client. So, but I think the bulk of my reservations with the diagnostic categories, they have to do with the idea that they can, and I say can because I imagine that that's not how it is for everyone, but I think they can lend themselves to a kind of simplistic and reductionistic idea that we somehow just need to figure out where the patient is on the spectrum, which diagnostic category the client fits into, and then activate the concomitant script and arsenal of interventions that go with that. I mean, sometimes that works out, but in my experience, a lot of times it's just not that simple or straightforward. I imagine that what I'm referring to is probably more related to how various students are perhaps receiving and applying what they're learning, rather than the intent of the teaching itself. But just tracking the patient moment to moment, with a close eye on anxiety pathways, the cell functions, the kinds of defenses that the patient is utilizing. That tends to be sufficient, for me anyway, to know whether or not I'm working at, above, or below the patient's capacity. I think that systematized and algorithmic work can give us bearings, it can help us orient and give us some ability to predict things, but I think it can also fail to capture greater nuances, complexity, obscure the real relationship and the human side of things. I mean, I imagine that all of us want to integrate technical precision with also being human, so in the end, I'm sure this just comes down to emphasis. The folks that have made efforts to make ISTDP more accessible by systematizing and operationalizing things, they deserve a lot of credit for doing that. I actually admire the ability to organize so much complexity into elegance and order, even if that's not where I devote most of my energies. So I think that as long as we don't confuse the map with the terrain, all will be well and the kinks will be ironed out. I think there's room to attend to our intuitions in this type of work, while simultaneously staying disciplined with adhering to the principles of the craft and guarding against confirmation bias mistakes. On page 3 in Unlocking the Unconscious, Davenlu writes that much of his work was reached intuitively. That alone, I think, speaks volumes. Though I think unlockings are often critical to character change and emotional healing, I don't think that they're actually be-all, end-all. And I think an overemphasis on them and the therapist becoming overly attached to them and pushing this agenda onto the client, I think that can be harmful. At times, the corrective emotional experience is just more important for some clients. At the same time, I believe that it's important not to collude with maladaptive defenses, and this means I sometimes take a strong stand. The head-on collision, in its many functions, uses, flavors, is central to my take on ISTDP, especially in regards to really helping the patient turn against their defenses, one of the most important tasks in this kind of work. So don't let the velvet glove fool you. There's an iron fist there as well. I believe that the perpetrator of the unconscious is a real motivational force, and that we underestimate that at our own risk. Some patients, well, many actually, employ resistance in the service of self-sabotage and self-punishment. And with these presentations and psychic organizations, more forceful and confrontational interventions can be critical. What Davenlu referred to as talking down to the superego or not bargaining with the superego. When the patient needs an unremitting vertical approach to the unconscious, meaning full-on heavy pressure and then blocking every defensive client response until there's an unlocking, I pursue that with the same enthusiasm as I have for the earlier stages of the work, or that I have for the kind of work with clients that need more encouragement and less, if any, confrontation. Marvin would always emphasize that even during heavy pressure and challenge, that it's important that there still be this felt sense of connection with the client. And that even when Davenlu was highly forceful and confrontational, that there was this underlying warmth towards the client. So, tough as nails with a tender heart, that's the idea. I'm reminded of Dr. Davenlu's nickname for Marvin. He called him the Japanese businessman. Apparently something having to do with being soft on the outside but tough on the inside. When I supervise and teach others, I focus on the principles that I have learned are critical to adhere to. But I also encourage my supervisees to not throw out their own personalities, their natural curiosity, their empathy, and the wisdom of their own life experiences, just because they're learning ISTDP. I have found that my own clinical work tends to become richer and more vibrant the more I allow my own genuine response to the client to be part of the work. And so I'm biased towards encouraging my supervisees to really bring who they are into their work as well. All my trainings and supervisions are stand-alone, I place so much value on personal autonomy that it never felt right to me to ask for any kind of time commitment. Plus, I just don't assume that I'll be helpful to people in perpetuity. I see myself as a work in progress and as a lifelong learner who has been fortunate enough to study with a real master. Though, keep in mind, Marvin always rejected that label. I am forever grateful to my teacher, Marvin Scorman, and to his teacher, Dr. Habib Davanloo. These two have changed the trajectory of my life, and for the better, my ability to have a positive impact on other people. I can never, ever thank them enough. In my own unique way and in whatever capacity that I'm able to, I'm about keeping the flame of the Scormanesque approach to ISTDP alive. It's a humbling task, but one that I'm up for. So why I prefer to call what I do ISTDP-informed rather than ISTDP, and I don't make that distinction religiously, I often forget, but if push comes to shove, I like to call what I do ISTDP-informed. Now, I've been massively inspired by Dr. Davanloo through reading his transcripts, meeting him a couple of times, watching his work, and then the major influence of him through the filter or lens of Marvin. So that's true, that's a fact. But I'd like to call what I do ISTDP-informed for two reasons. One, I just think it's more accurate based on the fact that I've adapted the model to fit my own proclivities and personality. But also, Davanloo never gave me a green light. He never said to me that I have permission to call what I do ISTDP. So for me, it just feels more respectful of the man that spent his whole life developing this model, and it just seems a bit more accurate. Thanks for taking the time to watch this. I hope that it gave you a flavor for what I'm about and how I think.